Thank you very much, Mr. Jaffrey, and welcome to everybody. I'm looking forward to this session. What I'm going to cover in the next 35 or 40 minutes is a description of a concept called mental toughness. It is a proper psychological term. Some of you may or may not have heard of the term, but it is probably the most important development in people development and in organizational development today. You may already have heard of other phrases in the world of organizational development and in business and in leadership development. People are increasingly talking about the importance of confidence, the importance of resilience, the importance of optimism, things like attitude and the importance of having a good attitude. All of those are ideas and concepts that interest all of us. We really want to know much more about them. We want to develop them in our organizations, but often it's very difficult to do that because they're not well defined and not well understood. Where the mental toughness model matters is that we have been able to map a concept, define a concept which embraces all of these ideas. And the useful thing about this framework is that it is quite easy to understand. I hope in 30 minutes time you will be able to say, I understand all of this. If we can understand it, then we can do something with it. We can implement it into our organizations. We can use it for our own development. We can use it for the development of the people that work with us. Incidentally, it's also important in the world of education. In the world, those of you who are involved in the world of education will know that increasingly around the world, people are concerned about ideas such as mindset, grit, character, and how these are important for student development, particularly developing students who are ready for the world of work. One of our big areas of work is that point of transition where people come out of education, go into the workplace, but as everybody knows, they're not really ready for work. Developing their mental toughness helps us to make sure that they're ready for the world of work. So, the first thing we'll do is we'll say, what is mental toughness? So, we have a definition. It's a personality trait which determines in large part how people deal with challenge, stressors and pressure, irrespective of prevailing circumstances. Now, there are some phrases there that are in italics. They're key. The first one is that it's a personality trait. We now know that mental toughness is a personality trait. That's important because if it's a personality trait, it means it sits in every single one of us. And every time we do something, our personality determines how we respond to the situation we find ourselves in. Mental toughness is one of those qualities, and in some ways, it may be one of the most important qualities. The second phrase is in large part. What that means is we can explain a lot of aspects around performance, well-being and behavior by understanding mental. We can't explain everything because there are other factors that may be involved, such as abilities and so on, but it's probably the single most important personality factor. And then how people deal with challenge, stresses and pressure. We are talking here about how people deal with life, not how people cope with life, although that is an option available to some people. And then finally, that phrase, irrespective of prevailing circumstances. That means, well, that's a response to a question that we get asked very often. People will often say when they're looking at personality, they'll say, oh, I'm different at work than I am at home. Mental toughness measures mindset. It measures how you think. In terms of how you think, you are not different when you're at work or at home or at play or at sports or doing something else. The way you think is pretty constant. So what we know is because it's a personality trait, it's universal and it's applicable to many walks of life. In fact, it applies to absolutely everything you do. At an organizational level, it also describes a key element of culture. Because although we're talking here about what mental toughness means to an individual, you can also use the same description for an organisation. Is the organisation mentally tough? Can that deal with challenge, stressors and pressure, irrespective of what's happening to them? Another point that sometimes we get challenged on is this word toughness. Some people don't like the word toughness, other people do like it. If we go to the United States, for instance, they're very comfortable with that terminology. When we're talking about mental toughness, we're not talking about toughness in the sense of being macho or domineering or aggressive. It is about mental toughness in the sense of resilience. So what a mental toughness that you're going to hear me describe is about being the best that you can be. It's about being comfortable in your own skin. And very much it's about accepting that life can be difficult, but that life, we all know that life is full of opportunities as well as threats. And understanding that when I come across threats, setbacks and problems, I know they're going to happen, but I know I'm also going to be able to deal with them. So there's a very strong positive theme in mental toughness. Is it important? It is. I said earlier, it may well be one of the most important of all the personality traits that we have, and one of the most important personality traits that we need to develop. We know that there's a very strong link with individual and organizational performance. Studies have shown that the mental toughness of an individual can explain up to 25% of the variation in performance or attainment. That is hugely significant when you think about all the factors that can impact on our performance. To think that one of those factors is responsible for almost a quarter of it is very significant. There's another factor that is very important, and that's obviously ability. If we have ability, we can perform. If we don't have abilities, we can't perform. But there's an interesting connection with mental toughness here. We all know people who have got lots of ability and still do not perform and still do not achieve. The main reason for that is their mental toughness. If they don't have mental toughness, then they won't use their abilities to the full. If they do have mental toughness, then they probably will. But it's important for two other reasons. One is behavior. If we step back and we look at what's happening around the world, what we notice is, as always, there's a lot of change going on. But the problem nowadays is that change happens so quickly. You have to have the ability to deal with it. You have to adopt a positive attitude towards change. We have to say, well, I didn't see that coming, but I know how to deal with it. And what we can see in mental toughness is that the people who develop mental toughness or who possess mental toughness adopt more positive behaviors. They tend to become more engaged with what's happening, but they also tend to be much more positive and adaptively with well-being. Here, people achieve more challenging way. So there tend to be that as I see that they enjoy. Another phrase for that would be happier. They're better at stress management, and they're less. So for those three, mental toughness has a significant everything we do. And it applies to so many things that we have to deal with. It applies to transition. It applies to managing change. It applies to leadership. It applies to our career management. It applies for students. It applies to it. We develop, and they come into the organisation, develop their mental are than people who are mentally sensitive, which is now mental toughness. At one end, people have got low levels of mental toughness sensitive. It is not mental weakness, it is mental sensitivity. And by that we mean that when things happen, sensitivity, things to get to them. And that is what inhibits their performance, that's what destroys their well-being, and that's what leads to negative behaviours and a cannot do attitude. Now, for 20 years, we've worked very closely with Professor Peter Clough, who is now acknowledged as the leading academic authority on mental toughness around the world. And his research, with which we have collaborated very, very closely, shows that the mental toughness model and the mental toughness concept has 4 components, which we call the 4 C's. That's control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. When combined, that will give us an overall measure of mental toughness. Now, towards the end of my little discussion, you will hear that we have developed a very high quality psychometric assessment, and we can measure these qualities on a scale of 1 to 10, like many psychometrics. What we know is that every listener to this webinar can have the same overall level of mental toughness, but we will have different profiles. So some of us may have a high level of control, but a low level of commitment. Some of us may have a high level of challenge, but a low level of confidence. Every single one of us will have our own unique profile. And for personal development, for self-awareness, that's why this model is important, because it allows us to find out what it is exactly about my makeup, my personality, that affects my performance and my well-being. So it's useful as we go forward from this point to think of mental toughness as mindset. That's a very good equivalent idea. So the first of the C's is control. This describes essentially to what extent you believe that you control your life and your emotions. The more that you feel in control, the more you're capable of achieving. It's where the sense of can-do sits. And what we know is that there are 2 elements to control. One is life control and the other one's emotional control. Now, a good way of testing this with individuals or on yourself is when you're asked to do something and you may be very, very busy, you may already have a lot on your plate, or when you ask somebody else to do something, you say, look, I have an important job to be done, can you do this for me? It needs to be done by Thursday. Somebody who has got a high sense of control is more likely to say, yes, I can do it. They won't necessarily know whether they can do it. That sounds a bit reckless, but actually, in their mind, they know that they can do it, and they will find the time to do it. And they will also stay in control of their emotions. So they won't panic, they won't get angry, they won't get annoyed. They won't waste that energy or that time on worthless activities. On the other hand, if you ask somebody who's mentally sensitive, who doesn't possess this quality, to do that, you might get a different sort of response. You might get a response along the lines of, leave it with me, I'll think about it. Or I'll do it, but. Or I'll do it if. As soon as you hear these phrases, if, but, I'll think about it, they are signals that that person will probably not do it. These are signals that the person's already thinking of reasons why they won't do it. So people with a high level of control have a can-do attitude. People with a low level of control tend to have a I can't do it attitude. So typically, what would somebody with a high level of life control do? Well, firstly, they believe they can make a difference. They happily multitask. So in that little example that I gave earlier, where we ask a busy person to take on another task. One of the reasons why they can do that is because they are already good at planning and organising. They have a natural ability to do that. So what they're actually saying inside their head is, I hadn't planned to do this additional work, but I know I have a bit of time on Wednesday, which I'd set aside for something else. It doesn't have to be done on Wednesday. I'll devote that time to this. And because they can plan and organise activities, they're capable of handling several activities at the same time. And of course, when we talk about attitude, their attitude is the cup is half full. Everything's possible. They will work hard as well to clear blockages. So people with a high level of life control won't allow things like I don't have enough time or I don't have enough resources to stop them from trying to do it. And then finally, they understand that the world isn't going to work perfectly smoothly. Problems will arise, there will be setbacks, but their attitude is that'll happen and I'll just have to deal with it when it happens. So that's what life control describes. Obviously, people with low levels of life control will have completely the opposite picture. When we talk about emotional control, what we're talking about here is the ability to manage your emotional response to situations. That's the ability to mask your emotions. Now that might sound deceitful, but if things are going wrong and you're the leader of the organisation, do you want to show everybody that you're worried, or do you want to show people that you're in control, you're in charge? So people who've got a high level of emotional control, who are mentally tough in the sense of emotional control, are people who are very good at managing their emotional responses to situations. They are also very good at masking anxiety. They'll maintain poise. And the key word here is masking anxiety. They're not anxious. They can be as nervous and as anxious as the next person. What they are very good at is not showing it. I learned that very early in my career when I first started to do presentations to large audiences of 200 or 300 people. When I first started to do it, I was frightened. I got very nervous. I got very anxious. Especially when I would have to speak alongside people who had been doing this for many years and who looked as though they just took things in their stride. What I very quickly learned was they were as nervous and as anxious and as frightened as I was. They just knew how to manage it. So this is very much about managing your emotions. So people who are mentally tough in this regard are very good at managing emotions. And one of the interesting consequences is they are very good at dealing with bullying behaviour. So they are less likely to allow bullies to impact upon them. The second of the 4 C's is commitment. Now commitment is sometimes described as stickability. It describes to what extent you as an individual want to make promises and the extent to which you will keep those promises. Now those promises are promises you can make to yourself. So in the world of college or university, you might make a promise to go and get a good degree. In the world of business, it might be a promise you make to a boss or a colleague that you will do something. Now, what's happening here is somebody who is mentally tough in terms of commitment, they're adopting a mindset that when they're asked to do something, their instinctive reaction, their default response is to say, I'll do that, and I'll do whatever it takes to achieve it. Now, one of the reasons why they do that is because it's one of the areas of satisfaction. People who set goals and targets will often do that because they know that when they achieve that goal and target, they can feel good about it. In a sense, they can give themselves positive feedback, they can give themselves a pat on the back. You can do that if you set a goal or a target, because when you set that target, that means you've achieved it. So these people are very good at translating goals and targets into pictures of success. and plans for attainment. They will visualize success, whereas people who've got low levels of commitment will often visualize failure. What they're very good at is setting goals and setting targets for themselves, things like personal bests. They also are happy to work hard and go for it, and they can be even enthused or excited by goals, targets and measures. Now, this commitment scale we find very interesting, particularly in organisations which operate performance appraisal systems. Because one of the things that we know from looking at this scale is that some of us are motivated by goals and targets, which are often the way that performance appraisal systems go. But we also know that a large proportion of the population, perhaps 30% of the population, is frightened of goals and targets. So if you have a performance appraisal system that is predominantly based on management by objectives, instead of motivating people, quite often you may be demotivating people. Now that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't have performance appraisal systems. We are in favour of that sort of approach. What it means is that you have to understand the individual, and sometimes you have to support the individual to see goals and targets in a positive light. So that's control and commitment, the first two components of mental toughness. There's an interesting connection here between what people talk about in terms of resilience and mental toughness. And resilience is, strictly speaking, the ability to deal with an adverse situation and still achieve some or all of what you wanted to do. So resilience applies when you're trying to do something and it suddenly starts to go wrong. It doesn't have to be your fault, it may be circumstances, but suddenly life becomes very difficult. If you can still maintain a sense of can-do, that's the control element, and still be determined to try to achieve what you originally set out to achieve, that's the commitment element, people will see you as a resilient person. Now, one of the interesting things about resilience, though, is if this happens too much to people who just have resilience, it can still wear them out. So although resilience is a very powerful and very important quality, sometimes it's not enough on its own. And one of the reasons why it's not enough on its own is that we can be resilient in two different ways. We can be resilient because we have to. So we don't really want to be resilient, but we know we have to, and we don't particularly enjoy it. Or we can be resilient because we want to, and we actually like dealing with life's problems and challenges. It's one of the areas where we get satisfaction. This is where mental toughness adds two components to the concept of resilience to create a more powerful, more widely embracing model, and a more proactive model. Now, the first of those components is challenge. Many years ago, in the 1980s and 1990s, a woman researcher in California was researching resilience. And one of the things she believed, her hypothesis, was that the higher up an organization an individual went, in other words, the more senior they became, the more resilient they would be. So she carried out a research, and that's what she found out. But to her surprise, she found out that there was something else. If she looked at ambitious, confident, resilient people, very often not only were they resilient, but they deliberately put their resilience into play. Now, what do I mean by that? Very simple example. If you have an ambitious manager and you give the manager an option of managing two departments, one is an easy department to run, there are absolutely no problems, all the staff are wonderful. The other department is a complete mess, all the staff are fighting each other, and it has a terrible reputation. A truly ambitious and challenging manager would prefer to deal with the second option, the more difficult option, because they got more satisfaction and more learning from sorting out a mess than they did from continuing with something that just happened normally. So she's realized that resilience was important, but there was actually another quality which was important. And she called this challenge, which is what I'm about to describe to you. And this really describes the extent to which you see challenge, change, adversity, and variety as an opportunity and not as a threat. So again, a little bit like our little example when we were talking about control. If we ask somebody to do something that they've never done before, say we say, we're going to open an office in Korea, we want you to go to Korea. Some people will say, fantastic, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm really interested to learn how Korean people work. I'm really interested to see how I can build a business in a country about which I may know very little. Other people will say, I don't want to know that, that frightens me. That is too much for me. So challenge is assessing that ability to stretch yourself, to take on new tasks, work with new people, and in a sense, being prepared to take some risks, some managed, some controlled, some careful risks. Essentially to do things that other people might not want to do. So that's one element of challenge. A second element of challenge, though, is that people who are of a high level of challenge also are quite happy to take risks, because even if something goes wrong, they will see that as a positive situation. They will see that it's an opportunity for learning. So if somebody's got a high degree of challenge, then if something goes wrong, they're more likely to say, that went wrong, but I think I've learned something from that. I now know how to do it better. In fact, I want to have another go because I want to make sure I can master this situation. Somebody with a low level of challenge is going to have the completely opposite reaction. They're going to say, oh, that was terrible. That didn't work at all. I never want to do that again. And they will avoid doing it again. So in a world that faces a lot of change and variety, and sometimes very, very abruptly, this ability to see setbacks not as problems, but as opportunities and learning opportunities is very, very valuable. We're beginning to do a lot of work in China, and in China, as you'll know, the economy has suddenly changed direction very, very quickly in more than one way. This is probably the most important element of mental toughness that the Chinese businesses that we're working with are concerned with. Incidentally, there's another valuable byproduct of looking at the challenge scale. We know, for instance, that when people run development programs such as soft skills programs or leadership and management programs, that if you assess the mental toughness of the participants before they enter the program, you'll notice that some have a high level of mental toughness. They will be looking forward to the program. They will get a lot of learning from the program, and they are more likely to implement what they learn after the program. People with low levels of mental toughness, especially with low levels of challenge, will enter the program intending to do as little as possible. They will even be fearful of entering the program, and they are very unlikely to apply anything they learn afterwards. So this is a very important scale for a lot of important reasons. And then finally, the fourth component is confidence. And this is predominantly the area where Professor Peter Clough and myself has done a lot of work to kind of understand what confidence is and why it's important. Essentially, confidence is about self-belief. It describes to what extent you believe you have the ability to deal with whatever you have to do. and whether you've got the inner strength to stand your ground when needed. So we know that there are two components to confidence. One is to have confidence in abilities, and the second one is to have interpersonal confidence. So we'll look at confidence in abilities first. People who've got a high level of confidence in abilities don't need other people to tell them they can do things or to encourage them to do things. People with low levels of confidence in abilities may have a lot of ability, but they will need a lot of encouragement. They will need people saying to them, of course you can do it. But these people have got that inner belief that is very, very important. People with high levels of confidence and abilities will often share information. They will Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for bearing with me. I think inadvertently the internet decided to test my mental toughness. So if this is a perfect example of how a mentally tough individual might respond to a setback, because they would either say, oh, that's it doesn't work, or you have to find a way of making it work. Now, I'm just...
That was a perfect case study, I think.
Right. Oh yeah, we've hidden the control panel. Right, I can't remember where we got to, but I think we were talking about confidence and abilities. And the point that I was about to make is that there are people with a lot of ability who don't use their abilities. Those are people who have got low confidence in abilities. So it's interesting, there can be an interplay here between having ability and using that ability. Of course, you can often find people who've got only a little amount of ability, who think they've got lots of ability. And they give us all particular problems, and we all have our names for those people. But having confidence in our abilities is obviously key to making sure we use our abilities, that we become the best that we can be. The other aspect of confidence is interpersonal confidence. And this is about having the confidence to deal with people who orally, that's in conversation and in discussion and debate with people who might challenge you, and they might be challenging you for very good reasons. They want to test out what you're going to say, and not to be frightened of that. I know people who will not do presentations because they fear somebody might ask them a very difficult question in a seminar, as you might at the end of this webinar. But we also see that people who've got a high level of interpersonal confidence are people who are more likely to influence people than they are likely to be influenced by people around them. So the kind of things that you would see an interpersonally confident person do is they will argue their corner, especially if they believe they're right. They tend to get their own way. They won't allow other people to orally dominate. They will often have a go. And interestingly, when you deal with them, they won't use short answers, yes, no, maybe. They will give you full answers. And this is particularly useful if you want to work with people, to share information, to explore, exchange information, and to explore information. So those are the two components of confidence. So we now have an understanding of the four components of mental toughness. And one useful way of summarizing this is to say, okay, so we did find a mentally tough individual, somebody who had got a high and a reasonable level of mental toughness across all the four components of mental toughness. What would be the kind of thoughts that would be running through their heads? Because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a mindset, what we're thinking. So the sort of things you would see is, I really believe I can do it. I can keep my emotions in check when doing it. I can manage my emotions. In my head, I promise to do things. I'm going to do them to an acceptable or a good standard. And when I've made a promise, I'll do whatever it takes to deliver it. When it comes to challenge, the thoughts will be, I'm motivated to do it. I'm happy to stretch myself. I'm happy to take risks. But importantly, I know I will make mistakes. I'm quite happy to acknowledge those mistakes. I'm not frightened of making mistakes, but I know I'm going to learn from those mistakes too. I may learn more from my mistakes than from the things I get right. And then finally, when you're talking about confidence, what's running through their head is, I believe I have the ability to do it, and I can persuade and influence others if I have to. So together, that gives you an understanding of what a mentally tough individual looks like. Now, very few of us actually think all the time in that way. I mean, it's not necessarily the case that we have to think all the time in that way. But what we do know is that by being self-aware about your mental toughness and understanding where on that little scale or that example I might have some development needs which explain why I don't often achieve as much as I should, or I don't feel as happy as I should, that's where mental toughness has a very significant and important value. How does it fit into current thinking? Well, in the last 15 years, as we said at the start of the webinar, we've seen an explosion of interest in this area. And the big names are people like Carol Dweck, Martin Seligman. These are people who have brought some academic thinking into this area. Carol Dweck has introduced the ideas of mindset. And if you look at that idea of mindset, the fixed and flexible mindset that she talks about, it is almost exactly the same as what we talk about when we talk about mental toughness and mental sensitivity. The advantage we have is we have a very clear and very structured model, so it's easy to pick up, easy to understand, and easy to apply. And then there are practitioners, people from the world of consultancy, people like Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great. Those of you who have read Good to Great will know that in Good to Great, he describes one of the key qualities for an organization as hardiness. Now that you've understood something about mental toughness, if you go back and read that chapter, you'll realize that what he's actually talking about is mental toughness. And then, of course, the big gurus, people like Warren Bennis, they talk about leadership, they talk about the importance of resilient leadership, and they talk about the importance of leaders being comfortable. And that goes, I mean, we've known that for a very long time, that goes way back through history. We remember that Confucius once said, find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. What that means is, if you have the right mindset, work isn't work, it's something you enjoy doing. Can you develop mental toughness? Well, you can. What we have, thanks to the work of Professor Clough and others, is we have, as you can see, a mental toughness model that has got a very clear framework. It's got the 4 C's. We can understand the model, which means that we can apply it to ourselves, we can apply it to people around us, we can apply it to organizations. The model provides us with the ability to diagnose, assess, and measure things at a very useful level, at a detail level, at the level of the 4 C's. To help us with that, we also have a valid and reliable and high quality psychometric measure called the Mental Toughness Questionnaire, the MTQ-48, which every listener to this webinar can complete free of charge if they wish, and we'll give the contact details later. If we can diagnose accurately, then we can also assess accurately what we actually need to develop and improve, and where is the best place to start. We can also develop interventions which are directed specifically to our development needs. So instead of running training and development programs that are one size fits all, or put everybody through the same program, or has a standard package, we can actually begin to introduce more sensible and more targeted development programs for people. And that can only benefit people. And then finally, the most important thing is, does it make a difference? Can we evaluate it? And will it actually produce a benefit for people, for me, my colleagues, and for the organisation? And that's where we have a real strength, because the value of the Mental Toughness Questionnaire is that you can assess people before and after a program. Because all we're doing here is we're assessing mindset. So we understand the mindset of people before we develop them. If we can assess their mindset after we've developed them, we can check both whether we've changed the mindset and where we've changed the mindset. That's critically important. That's something that is actually very, very difficult to do at the moment. Most organizations use pretty crude means of doing this. They will use things like happy sheets. So what we have here is the ability to evaluate and assess very accurately a key element of our personality, our mindset. Can we develop it? Well, we can. In fact, in the world of sport, leading sports coaches have been developing mental toughness for some time. Since the 1980s, the great managers and coaches include people like Alex Ferguson of Manchester United into that. He was capable of taking competent footballers and turning the team into world beaters. We can do that in businesses, in schools, in organizations of all types. Mental toughness development activities fall into 6 categories. One is positive thinking tools and techniques. And essentially here we're doing probably one of 3 things. We're either showing people how to turn negative thoughts into positive thoughts, or we're teaching people how to think positively all the time, or we're teaching people how to stop thinking negatively. Visualization is the second main area, and interestingly, we don't have to teach anybody to visualize. We visualize anyway. We visualize all the time. What we often do is visualize things going wrong instead of how can we make things go right. So there's some training that's very useful around there. The third area is anxiety control, and these are the typical stress management tools and techniques. These are the relaxation techniques, the muscular relaxation techniques, things like controlled breathing. And essentially, those techniques that help you deal with that panic moment. So something's gone wrong and suddenly you panic, and that impacts on your breathing and on your muscles, and it almost paralyzes you. Well, there are tools and techniques that enable you to deal with that. And then the fourth area is probably the most important and the most underdeveloped area in people development, and that's attentional control. That's teaching people how to focus longer, and how to focus better. The average attention span of a person these days is assessed at about 8 minutes. We can improve attention span up to 45, 50, sometimes 90 minutes, which means that if you're doing an intellectual piece of work, like reading, writing, studying, listening, it is a very difficult thing to do if you have a short attention span. The fifth area is goal setting, And interestingly, the test itself is an important development tool, because what we find is that roughly 50% of cases, when people look at their test results and read the report that goes with the test, they will often say, well, I now understand myself better. Now that I can understand myself better, I think I know what to do to improve. And so a key theme here is self-awareness is important. And self-awareness is important for both people who need to develop their mental toughness, that is, to become more mentally tough, and possibly the subject of another webinar or a more in-depth discussion. You may be surprised to know that there are development needs for people who are mentally tough, because one of the sometime consequences, it doesn't happen all the time, is that people who are mentally tough, they obviously are capable of achieving a lot. But in the process of achieving things and getting on with things, they sometimes intimidate and impact on the people around them, and they affect their performance. So even for people who are mentally tough, if they want to optimize their impact, they often have development needs, and self-awareness is important for them too. So what are the applications? Well, around the world, the most common applications are in leadership and management development. Clearly, if you develop the mental toughness of the people at the top of an organization, that will impact on the culture of the organization, and it's a very good way of developing a mentally tough culture. Staff development, student or new recruit development. Across the Gulf, we're seeing a particular interest in what is broadly called Arabization programs. That's taking graduates out of universities and colleges and putting them through short programs that are mental toughness based, that help them to develop life skills so they can become effective in the workplace very quickly. Mental toughness is important in organizational development, but clearly it impacts on a very important aspect of culture. And of course, it's important in recruitment and selection. The mental toughness questionnaire is a normative measure, but because mental toughness is something called a plastic personality trait, what we recommend is that people use the measure to understand the kind of people they're bringing on board, not necessarily to filter out people, because if you can do something about the mental toughness and they have got other qualities they can bring on board, well, you know, you might be able to do something about their mental toughness. So, can you assess mental toughness? Well, I've already made reference 2 or 3 times. There is a 48-item mental toughness questionnaire, which takes typically about 10 minutes to complete. It's available online, it's available in Arabic, it's actually available in about 20 languages, and it produces a full set of reports. The reports include an individual development report, which gives information back to the individual with development suggestions. There's a coaching report, which goes to the person's coach or manager, which provides coaching suggestions that they can use. There is an assessor report, which is designed to generate interview questions to help people probe the candidate's mental toughness. And then there are 2 other reports. One is a distance travelled report, where you can measure people before and after and see their results on the same graph. And finally, of increasing importance, is a group report. So what we see is that organisations will often not just test 1 or 2 managers, they'll test all the managers in the organisation and look at the profile and look at the patterns, because that tells them a lot about the readiness of their organisation to deal with challenge, change, adversity, and the opportunities that come their way. So the measure is very easy to use, very short training period, it's got some very useful reports, and it's available in Arabic. So to summarise, the benefits of looking at all of this is the mental toughness model is helping us to understand something about people which is fundamental to their performance and well-being. It's got a very simple, very accessible framework. We've managed to capture all the thinking and present it in a very simple, clear model. And it applies to anything we do. every single aspect of our soft skills development rests upon our mindset, which is mental toughness. And through the questionnaire, through the psychometric, we have the ability to evaluate reliably what you're doing with your people. But most importantly, mental toughness is an enabler, which enables you to translate what you do into personal and business success. So, finally, and a little bit behind schedule, I do apologise for that. I'm happy to take questions. Anybody who's interested in completing the mental toughness questionnaire, you can email us and a password will be emailed to you in confidence together with a copy of these slides. So my email address is doug@aqr.co.uk and Orla Spencer, who is based in our Dubai office, is orla@aqr.co.uk.
Well,
I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Douglas, for a very interesting presentation. Folks, we are now open for the question and answers. So if you have any questions, you could either put it in the question box or you could equally raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console, so please click on it if you want to speak directly with Douglas. Let me go to the question box. We have the first one from Mr. Sufyan Lamali. The question is, how do components of mental toughness relate to other psychological constructs, like learning, agility, for instance?
Okay, well, that's it. It's a very, very interesting question. And if we have another 4 hours, I'm sure I could answer that fully. The mental toughness, let me respond to that, perhaps not directly, but indirectly, and I hope that the person who's asked the question would understand the response. When we look at developing people and we look at psychology, what we're actually talking about is showing people how to change or develop or grow their personality in some way. This is a very broad picture, and it's not meant to be a very technically correct response, but broadly we can talk about personality being consisting of 3 broad areas. One is how we act, and one of the reasons why we like looking at that is because that's what we mean when we're talking about behaviour. So almost all organisations will develop competency frameworks with descriptions of desired behaviours in an organisation. And the reason why we like doing that is because behaviours are obvious. We can see behaviour, we can observe behaviour, so we're comfortable with that. And in fact, a lot of traditional psychological models are based on our understanding of behaviour. A lot of psychometric measures, particularly things like the Big 5 measures, are behaviour-orientated psychometric measures. The second area of personality that we are interested in and we try to shape is the area of emotions and feelings. And again, we are comfortable with that because we can describe our emotions and our feelings to a great extent, and we can often see emotions and feelings, except in those people who master their emotions and feelings, to a significant extent. And again, there's a fairly well developed set of tools, instruments and thinking around that area. The third area is how we think, and that is the least well developed area, but that is the area that I've been talking about. And the importance of how we think is that it impacts on how we feel and it impacts on how we act. So to get a complete picture of an individual, we really need to understand all 3 aspects of their personality. When we only look at 1 or 2 of them, it explains why a lot of the activity we carry out is not as effective as it should be. So for instance, a lot of training and development programs are focused on behavior. We'll talk about behaviors, we'll show people behaviors, we might let people practice behaviors, and then we expect people to apply those behaviors when they go back into the workplace or into school or home. And we're not surprised to find that very few people do actually do that. the success rate of behavioural-based training is not great. And one of the reasons for that is that we haven't actually changed the mindset. We haven't changed the way the person thinks. So the person still thinks the way they did before they were introduced to new behaviours. They're not going to behave any differently. So that's kind of an oblique response to the question. There is we can go into a more technical response, but I'm not sure that we'll have enough time at the moment. For instance, we're beginning to see interplay with ideas such as emotional intelligence, and more importantly, with intelligent emotions. So, and those of you who are familiar with emotional intelligence may know that there's a lot of people questioning emotional intelligence now, and they're beginning to replace it with probably a more robust idea, which is intelligent emotions, which does link very closely to what we're doing. So I'm not sure that I've answered the individual's question fully, but I hope that the individual can see what I'm driving at.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a supplementary one. Is there any risk to score very high in mental toughness, or is there any derailer type behavior related to it?
Well, yes, there is, and that's a very, very good question. There is a potential, because if somebody, the people who are mentally tough will tend to achieve things. They will naturally have a mindset that enables them to adopt a can-do approach. They'll always deliver. They will be fearless. They won't see threats in the same way as the rest of us, and they'll be completely confident, and they'll often be so confident that they'll intimidate people around them. If we look at the 4 C's, if you've got very high levels of mental toughness, you as an individual will achieve a lot. You'll be doing very well. It's your impact on the people around you that begins to become an issue. So if you've got a high sense of can-do, typically you may intimidate or you might frighten people around you. If you've got a high level of emotional control, sometimes people can't read you, or you begin to be quite manipulative. If you've got a high level of commitment, sometimes you will take on more than you can reasonably handle. And especially if you take on more on behalf of other people, you'll drown them with work. If you have too high a level of challenge, then you run the risk of taking too many risks, or sometimes doing things purely for the pleasure of doing it. It's almost a hedonistic approach. If you've got too high level of confidence and abilities, you can be a big head. If you've got too high level of interpersonal confidence, you can sometimes inhibit other people because you are so competent orderly, you block out everybody's ability to contribute. So there are potential downsides for the individual, and nearly all of these downsides relate to the way that you deal with other people. But of course, the issue here is self-awareness. In the same way that a mentally sensitive individual, somebody with a low level of mental toughness, may not understand why they're not achieving so much, somebody with a very high level of mental toughness might have in their head, well, if I'm so wonderful, why aren't I achieving as much with the people around me? So yes, it's a very good question. There are potential downsides. They're not all actual downsides, but people do fall prey to those kind of downsides. And again, self-awareness is key. And again, it's one of the big values of the psychometric measure. We find people who are mentally tough often respond to feedback about themselves in a very positive way. They're so driven sometimes to achieve, to enjoy well-being, and to be satisfied and to be content. They're not comfortable with things that don't seem to work, and they welcome the opportunity to find out what that is and to put it right. So there are potential downsides. Self-awareness is the key, and those people will often be motivated to do something about it.
Thank you very much. I know we're taking a little extra time since we had a technical glitch in between, so let me go straight and just have one more questions. How can you develop mental toughness or mindset in individuals and organizations? What are the benefits? This can be two questions here.
Right. Well, if you develop mental toughness, what you're really developing is an enabler. Mental toughness is a mindset that allows you then to achieve more, to enjoy better well-being, and of course to behave more positively. That has to produce tangible benefits for most organizations. We know, for instance, in the world of education, there is now a very clear link between mental toughness of students and their education attainment levels. We also know that there's a very clear link between mental toughness and their ability to build relationships, i.e. make friends, which is a very important activity in schools. In business, you get very similar effects. Developing mental toughness enables you to become a more effective person. You begin to achieve more. Now, as with many other aspects of people development, there is an interplay between the organization and the individual. So if the organization doesn't possess that kind of culture, doesn't have that kind of mindset, if you like, but you want to try and develop some individuals to become more positive and more effective, if you don't change the culture of the organization, quite often you will send people back into a culture that doesn't enable them to use what their new skills or their new mindset, should I say. And so assessing individuals and the prevailing mindset of the organization is important, because to change things you need to change both. You can't just change one. You can't change the culture of the organization and not change the people to match it, and conversely you can't change people and not change the culture of the organization. You need to do both. And that's what people often forget. We routinely get requests for training and development programs. People say, I want a leadership and management training program for 60 staff, and they think that that's going to make a difference. It might, and it might make a small difference, but if they're not consciously changing the organization to optimize this, it won't happen. Hello?
One thing, yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Douglas. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I really want to thank you on behalf of the Medina Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for taking the time to deliver this live webinar. So thank you very much, sir, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. So our apologies for a slight technical glitch that we encountered during the webinar, but I'm glad that we got it over and Mr. Douglas was back. So once again, thank you all of those who attended this webinar. We are recording it. It will be uploaded on Mile Community, so please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to learn about the upcoming webinars and to access the archives. With that note, we'd like to end this webinar, so you all will be automatically dismissed out. Thank you very much. You all have a good day.